Welcome, everybody. My name is Stefano Feltri. I work as communication advisor for the Institute for European Policy Making. So while we wait that everybody joins the event, let me just to introduce the Institute and our defense program. So the Institute for European Policy Making at Bocconi University is basically a policy accelerator for academic research. So the idea is to create a bridge between academic scholars and academic research and the actual policy making, and to shape basically the policy conversation with data-driven findings and ideas. So as almost everybody in Europe, we have been forced by recent events to include geopolitics and defense and security in our discussion. As you probably know, economists are not always familiar with defense issues, but now they are catching up. That is why the IEP, which is a multidisciplinary organization, but strongly rooted in core Bocconi fields such as economics, finance, monetary policy, trade, industrial organization, and so on, now is deeply interested in defense and security issues. That's why we asked Andrea Gilli, who is a IEP non-resident fellow, to draft a policy brief, which is now published in its final version, which is focused on the policy dilemmas that Europe is facing in the defense realm. This is the first event we have to discuss this policy brief, and we invited the perfect speaker for such an occasion, Olesya Vinhas de Souza. I hope I pronounced it correctly. She currently works at the NATO Defense College, where Andrea previously held a position, and she's an expert in Russian security issues, Russian army, and more broadly in defense issues related to what is crucial to all of us, which is deterrence and security on the eastern front of Europe. So in this conversation, we will start with Olesya to frame the problem we are facing, and then we will move to Andrea to discuss the potential response that Europe can choose, and the trade-off that different strategies implies. I remember to all of you that we are on the record, that if you want to intervene in the conversation, you can either use the chat box and the Q&A box, or raise your digital hand, and in the Q&A part, you will be invited to share your ideas, to ask your question, or we will read it loudly if you prefer the written version. So, Olesya, thank you again for joining us. Let's start with you to discuss the state of the art of the conflict. The very first question is, are we getting closer to a ceasefire in Ukraine, and which is the implication of a potential ceasefire? Because I read one recent publication of yours where basically you say that there is a huge discussion how fast Russia can catch up with the NATO defense capabilities if we give them the time to rebuild their stockpiles, to update their equipment. So basically, is a ceasefire the premise for a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, or is it it might be the proof that the so-called Trump doctrine of peace through strength can create a sustainable situation in the medium long term without a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia?
There are so many questions, important questions. First of all, important disclaimer, I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I am not representing either NATO official or NDC, NATO Defense College official position. So I will put in hat of researcher where I am now here. So let me just make sure that we understand the situation correctly. So we're talking about potential ceasefire but I think it's more accurate description to discuss describe the situation as not as stalemate. We are in the ongoing war of attrition, with both, particularly Russian side, taking advantage of the volume of ammunition and particularly artillery, and being able to impose high costs on the civilian population by targeting critical infrastructure and energy in the health systems, weaponizing civilians, not respecting the law of international warfare. But at the same time, we also observed the remarkable ability of the Ukrainian armed forces to improvise and engage in the rapid change strategic maneuvers, and that created important strategic dilemmas, such as the entering the Russian territory, proper Russian territory. So at the end of the day, what we have now on the ground, both sides are realizing that they are at the nothing changes, keeping everything constant at the level of the support, the Western support that we're providing. So we're close to the stalemate in the this like war of attrition, right? So this creates potential discussion for the ceasefire agreement, but then the big question becomes is, okay, what would be the security guarantees that would make this ceasefire sustainable over the long run? We're not looking for a medium term, like 2 to 3 years frozen conflict solution with Russians rebuilding, restructuring, regrouping, expanding their military production, which they've been doing rather successfully, and then striking again. So we want the security guarantees, if it's not NATO membership for Ukraine, what would be alternative ones, because at the end of the day, we want the resolution of the conflict that is going to be sustainable over the long time, and that's basically where we are. Anything else I should add? I don't know how much time I have.
No. We take the first part of the meeting for the 2 main speakers, and then we move to Q&A. So in terms of choices on military spending and defense spending, equipment spending, what are the implications of this situation? I found particularly interesting what you covered in your publication about how the Russian army works and what are its intrinsic fragility due to the non-democratic nature of the Russian regime. So basically, if you can explain how it works, and in that realm, if time works is on our side or on their side, if a longer conflict can make the Russian army weaker or stronger.
Oh, okay, that's really important question, because we have to understand what are the bottlenecks in the Russia's ability to sustain the ongoing effort. And so if you look at the high level numbers, the Russians been rather capable to expand their budgetary expenditures. They went in pre-war. I'll just give you one number. I dislike people putting lots of numbers on the table, but just to give you the scale in terms of the budget, military budget. In 2021, they were close to 4 trillion rubles, which was like close to $50 billion. But then in 2024, their budget increased 4 times. Okay, if you look in the ruble terms, so they went to 13 trillion rubles. If you look at dollar terms, it's not that impressive. It's also impressive, $140 billion, but because of the exchange rate, it becomes a little bit tricky. So the idea is that they are capable at the macro level, and they also expanded the production much faster than we expected, in spite of the sanctions and the limitations of the on the critical technologies. But at the end of the day, this is the on the surface. However, if you start looking at this rather complex, let's say, devil in the details, at the end of the day, there are certain issues that we need to be paying more attention, because these are the potential vulnerabilities. Okay, so first vulnerability is the manpower generation. Okay, so the way how the Kremlin has been trying to sustain its war of attrition is by avoiding the mass conscription and mass draft. They tried to do it during after the first months of invasion in September 2022, and it frankly backfired because of the lots of resistance from the relevant parts of the regime and supporters of the regime. And what that also exposed that the overall support for the conflict in terms of the ideological is relatively weak. So what people are trying to do, they're trying to defy and find the loopholes in the Russian legal system, going from bribing the authorities who are responsible for recruiting, for military recruiting, fleeing the country, or finding the additional legal loopholes not to be drafted. And I think Kremlin learned the lessons, so they are relying consciously on the financial incentives. They try to make the package, the sign-up package, more and more financially attractive. But what happens because of the expanding of the military expenditures, the demand for labor force increased. So now you have wages which are making much more attractive for the people to stay in the private sector rather than sign the military contracts. So it imposes a significant budgetary pressure on Kremlin, whether they will be able to sustain this voluntary-based effort that doesn't require another way of conscription. So that's one issue. The second issue is also budgetary, expenditures. So how long the Kremlin will be able to push the cost of war on other actors, okay? And who are those other actors? These are regional governments who are expected also to chip in from the regional budgets into the military efforts rather than by supplying the voluntary battalions, meaning that they have to recruit also the volunteers to fight. The other contributing to the military production and paying for the people who are injured, because then there is a huge issue of rehabilitation, like what are you going to do with those who are coming back and how do you reintegrate them into the society, especially if they're injured, and what are you doing with the benefits to the families, right? And then the private sector, that's also very important because they've been very preferential treatment of the private sector, how they are, which industries are protected from the draft and which are considered to be critically important, which industries receive lucrative government contracts, right, military contracts, and which industries are supposed to be footing the a cost of war by also either paying indirectly to the people who are fighting or paying heavy taxes. Also, we should not forget that lots of military expenditures are paid through the higher taxes and higher fees. So how destabilizing it's in the short term? Probably no. But over the long time, it creates the kind of grievances that could potentially kind of be exploited. Not sure in which way and how now, but this creates opening in the stability of the regime. I will leave it as such.
Just a very final question before moving to Andrea. Is this situation compatible with a potential direct confrontation between Russia and the NATO, or what you are describing is a fragile equilibrium that in the medium term make Russia capable of sustaining a war of attrition in Ukraine, maybe some form of deterrence and so on, but it is not a real situation, a potential situation to escalate the war at a level which imply a direct confrontation with the NATO.
Is it a question to me or a question to Andrea?
To you. Then we go
to me. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So let's put it this way. For Russia to be able to scale up the ongoing military effort in Ukraine, they have to increase their, to begin with, the footprint in terms of manpower generation. They have to arm the EU forces. So within a year or two, honestly, I do not see imminent danger, or is there ability to do that? I mean, two to 3 years, especially with the upholding the sanction regime, depriving them of the critical technologies, imposing constraints on their ability to generate revenues through the sales of energy. So if the current regime sustains, I don't see indicators for that, but over long run, I really cannot say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Andrea, now it's up to you. In your policy brief before Vegetius, critical questions for European defense that I ask my colleagues to share in the chat so that everybody can download and read it. Basically, you introduce a strategic approach to a discussion on military and defense expenditure that usually is limited to the aggregate numbers. And what Olesya helped us to understand is that depending on which assumption you do on the situation and which expectation you have on Russian attitude in the medium-long run, then policy response change completely. So can you help us to apply the framework you develop in the policy brief to the analysis that Olesya has just shared with us?
Yes, yes. So first, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the organization. Thanks also to Olesya for being with us. Actually, she's not only working where I used to work, but she has my same office. So that's and also I sympathize because Stefano and I met on TV, and the very first time we met on TV, I had to start saying this is my personal opinion, not the NATO Defense College, and so forth. So I sympathize that it doesn't look as great for the outsiders, but I totally understand your position. So thanks for this. What you said was very interesting. And obviously, I don't have your expertise with respect to Russia, internal and military and economic potentials and capabilities, but I'll try to connect what Stefano just mentioned. And is the following. I think that European countries, NATO allies together have to do some clear calculations and reasoning about what they want to achieve, what they can achieve, and what Russia can do and how Russia could react. So based on what Olesya said, for instance, there are some inevitable bottlenecks which Russia has experienced, is experiencing, and likely will be experiencing in the next months and eventually years. So the first issue would be to try to orient our defense expenditure or military capabilities in order to increase dramatically the cost of Russia's operations. So regardless of the rest, at the end, the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia from the very beginning were an alternative to the use of force. So very simply, European countries, NATO allies, wanted to stop Russia's military machine. The most obvious solution was to bomb Russia, but they didn't want to do it. So what's the alternative? You use sanctions, and through sanctions, you try to reduce the production of military capabilities. But we know that Russia was able, got a shock, but then was able to still withstand some of the sanctions through internal developments, by evading the sanctions, by getting support from Iran, North Korea, China, and so forth. So that would be one area where definitely is important to start going. So both increasing the sanctions as well as force some of those bottlenecks to explode. One area is definitely machineries, components, and related. As to defense spending and military planning more in general, the challenge for Europe, and we see what is happening in the Baltics with those cables being cut. It's obvious that the more European countries support Ukraine, the more Ukraine is able to withstand, the more Russia has an incentive to create problems to Europe in other areas. So first was by promoting instability in the Middle East with the fall of Bashar al-Assad. In a way, this is partially undermined, but the other is attacking critical infrastructures as well as all those arson attacks that Russia has been doing. So the issue is, what do European countries want to do similarly to complicate the calculation of and the planning of Russia. The reality is that European countries are not doing much. The one who is doing the most is Ukraine by launching long-range drone strikes within the territory of Ukraine of Russia, because in this way Ukraine is forcing Russia to move resources away from the battlefield and back into its homeland for the defense of those critical infrastructures. So, a few other considerations, obviously, feel free to ask more precise issues, but what I would probably discuss is how we make sure that the military machine of Russia implodes. And here there's a crucial trade-off, which is hard to kind of navigate, because NATO over the past now 3 years has been focused on two main tasks, on two main goals. That is supporting Ukraine as well as strengthening the eastern flank, as you mentioned, through its deterrence and defense posture. However, you mentioned at the beginning, Bocconi is a university focused on economics. The first principle of economics is that resources are scarce. So if resources are scarce, this means that if you allocate them to deterrence and defense, you have less resources for the support of Ukraine. So here the critical calculation is what's the ratio of support which to Ukraine vis-a-vis deterrence and defense, which is optimal to securing the success of Ukraine, preventing it to collapse. And that's not an easy calculation, but that's probably important to do, because if European countries put too much effort on deterrence and defense, the risk is that Ukraine falls apart. And then the very deterrence and defense for which they're planning will become much harder should Russia conquer Ukraine. The other way around, if they provide too much support to Ukraine, obviously Russia could have an incentive to try to check NATO, I would say, credibility on its deterrence and defense posture, and trying to create problems some of the other borders. So obviously, I don't have perfect answers, but these are some of the trade-offs and issues. And please, if you have other related questions, please.
No, I have a question, Andrea, that really puzzles me. Olesya told us that basically we don't know how dangerous is Russia in the medium long term because of this interplay between what is called a successful war economy. I mean, they created a sustainable way to switch the focus of all the policy-making activities to support war, and the inner tensions of a non-democratic society with financial fragilities dependent on sanctions and so on. So we don't know how dangerous it is in the medium term. But for the reason you were saying, we face today a trade-off between investing in winning the battle, or that, but this doesn't imply necessarily winning the war in the long run. And the reverse is true. If we try to win the war in the long run, we can lose the battle, and so the war in the short run. So is there any way from the strategic perspective you use in the paper that can help policymakers to decide what is the optimal outcome, or the only choices they face is how to go in both directions at the same time without undermining one of the two options? So we are forced to do both, to win in the short run and to create the premise for deterrence, even if these two approaches apparently are incompatible or they disperse resources.
Yeah, so I would say that 2 or 3 years ago, at the beginning of the war, this trade-off was probably less salient. Now my ex-post rationalization is that European NATO countries, Western countries, did a mistake because they should have provided way more military support to Ukraine early on. So all those debates about the F-16, the Taurus, the Leopard, the HIMARS that were escalatory, these just ended up playing the game of Russia, which was very happy to scare European countries, and in this way progressively facing a Ukrainian military which was less capable. Now, so back then, the trade-off was obvious, just help massively Ukraine. Right or wrong, things didn't go this way. And now the situation is a bit more complex. I tend to believe that there's so much an autocratic country can achieve in terms of military production. So it's okay if you have to build artillery shells, okay-ish infantry fighting vehicles, tanks. If you want to build advanced capabilities, air defense systems, jet fighters, an autocratic and basically closed economy, there's so much they can do. So in the medium to long term, they can generate a lot of military equipment, but of lower and lower quality, which to a certain extent, it's something which does help us. The challenge is that Russia still have nuclear weapons, and that's something we cannot rule out from the table. If I were a policymaker, what would I do more? Probably a few issues which are mostly non-military, directly military related, which is first, make the sanctions much harsher in every possible way. So we want that Russia does not have access to anything which can help them. Second, make a scheme to attract every possible engineer still based in Russia to come to Europe. At the end, if the military production still requires some know-how, and if even a small part of this know-how flees, that's a setback. Probably the issue of all the assets, the frozen assets, should be used to support the Ukraine campaign and reconstruction, because this would immediately like Russia what is happening. The fourth and final issue is the trickiest one. That is, bring China on our side so that China stops supporting the war. This is much harder for a very simple issue that strategically China, so far as the US and NATO and Europe is bogged down in Ukraine, there's way less attention necessarily to East Asia. And so it's way more complicated. But should the West be able to achieve the support of China? Probably this would be a major setback for Russia. Unfortunately, that's difficult to achieve.
Yeah, but it's not completely out of the equation if you watch the speech that the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen gave in Davos at the World Economic Forum. Basically, she left the door open for some kind of new beginning in a relationship with China due to the arrival of Donald Trump, which create even more tensions between Russia and US. But before opening the question, the Q&A, we already received one from Daniel, our director, Daniel Gross. I wanted to ask Olesya to jump in about nuclear deterrence, because Andrea mentioned the risk of an escalation toward a nuclear war. Even if we don't get there, this is part of the equation. If we need to rebuild a stronger nuclear deterrence, it's expensive, but it's doable. It's not doable, for my understanding, to build a double nuclear deterrence against both Russia and China at the same time. I mean, the US have to choose, and we as European probably cannot face this dilemma in the same way. So we saw that Russia recently changed its nuclear doctrine. Is this a relevant issue? Is it something that should shape the policy-making discussion about what is the top priority in terms of military investment in Europe or not?
Well, okay, I actually glad that you brought it up, because it was one of the points that I wanted to follow up on what Andrea made. So first of all, we have to understand in terms of the innovation. So one point, a little bit like a push back a little bit on Andrea's comment, was that the authoritarian regimes can produce high quality weapon systems. Maybe in the long run, they run out of steam. But what we've seen in the short run, I think it's rather impressive. And it's an important wake-up call that we should keep in mind. So Russians were able to demonstrate a remarkable ability to learn from their mistakes during the first 6 months. They completely reorganized their force structure. They switched from the expeditionary type forces into the Soviet-style division-based ground forces for prolonged conflict on the Russia's territory, I mean, close to the borders to the Russian territory. We also see they are perpetually expanding hypersonic capabilities. Today, or like yesterday, there was lots of publicity about Russia's deployment of their first Arkhangelsk-type nuclear submarine in the Arctic region, which puts their nuclear submarine capabilities, like new generation, and they're planning to produce close to 12 of those, within very short span. They deployed glide bombs, which are actually people consider as a game-changing technology because they are out of the Ukraine's air defense systems, and they are rapidly catching up with the with unmanned autonomous systems like AK drones. And what we see actually, it takes about 3 to 6 months to neutralize the innovations that Ukrainians are putting in the theater and undo them. And so what we've seen so far, they've been remarkably agile and capable of innovation and learning lessons and deriving lessons from their failures. Now, in terms of the nuclear capabilities, so if you just look at the language of their new updated nuclear doctrine, most of the things that it says, it's kind of been happening already de facto. They're just making them de jure in terms of the conditions under which the nuclear capabilities will be employed. But what was interesting this time, it was the first time since their updating of the nuclear doctrine, then they actually followed by demonstration of new capabilities, right? We saw they deployed the new missile in Oreshek in Russian terms. So that was signaling, important signaling that we're putting the money where the mouth is. So we have these capabilities. And also shortly, for example, preceding the publicity about the Arkhangelsk nuclear submarine, Lavrov, Russia's defense minister Lavrov, went also on the air saying, look, do not provoke Russia. So what we see now, we see not just rhetoric and nuclear bullying, if you would like, but they try to synchronize it with also concurrent display of capabilities. So this is what's worrisome. Yeah, then I'm open to the questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Olesya. This is extremely interesting. So we move to a couple of questions. I invite all the other guests to write down their questions or to raise their digital hands. So Daniel, which I assume is Daniel Gross, our director, he asked if Russian sabotage in the Baltic Sea could have two positive implications for Europe. Because it makes clear that it's make a case for a common defense, and it gives Europeans training in safeguarding critical infrastructure. This is the first question. Then we have Roberto Castaldi, who writes the following. The NATO Madrid summit last July decided that the new force model, which provides, in case of threat, the mobilization of 300,000 European troops in 1 month. Before the US come to the rescue during the second mobilization of 500,000 troops. Can EU defense be created as a European pillar of NATO? And this is a super interesting question because it relies to the big debate of what does it mean to create a European defense and which relations it should have with NATO, especially in terms of operabilities and concrete deployment on the field and who decides what. So Olesya, if you want to go first, then we go to Andrea.
Well, okay, then very interesting and completely different questions. Okay, so in terms of sabotage of the critical undersea infrastructure, I think it's an important wake-up call for all of us that it's brought us on the same page in terms of the threat assessment and the threat picture That's what we're dealing with. So unfortunately, I should say, we waited for way too long to start actually converging on this position. So it's an important kind of trigger of converging. And we saw actually very interesting developments. I mean, going from the creation of the recent summit, so the creation of additional NATO capabilities to address this, also supporting the innovation via Diana. This is the Defense Accelerator, Innovation Accelerator, to scale up private sector solutions that translating them, making them dual capable to address this type of issues. So whether it's going to be sufficient, it depends how fast the Russians are expanding their capabilities. I don't have open source data on that, so I cannot comment. Now, in terms of very quickly, in terms of the understanding of how does European defense fits into the NATO defense infrastructure, I think we have to start kind of understanding that talking about one or another as a separate, it's a little bit misleading because of the 27 EU members are also NATO members. I think the question is here is transatlantic relations. How does what we do in Europe corresponds to what the United States are doing, as well as now we have UK and Canada. So it's the issue of the transatlantic unity and interoperability rather than anything else. But Andrea might disagree, so go ahead.
The floor is mine?
Yeah,
Yes.
sure.
So no, I don't disagree I start from the second question. I think that the key is that the EU and NATO have fundamentally different responsibilities. So, and also powers and authorities. So the EU has a budget, has the capacity to tax, has the capacity to adopt regulations, has the capacity to monitor and enforce regulations. Its responsibilities are in several relevant areas, including industry, markets, infrastructure, research. And these are all areas that are fundamental for European defense, no matter what is the heading. So, and I think that it's not a personal preference, but it's more like an analytical conclusion that I think in the years ahead, what we'll see is probably the EU and NATO working more and more together because the two organizations have, as I said, the different key focus areas. So Europe helping to produce, generate, fund weapons productions, which in turn go and defense capabilities more in general, which in turn are then planned, organized by NATO. Obviously, many things can happen. I cannot predict the future, but as things are now, these would probably be the most consequential path. Whether it's good or not, okay, there may be different opinions. On Daniel's question about the tax to critical infrastructure and what it means, so I just want to step back, connecting it to the question you made earlier about what capabilities are relevant. So definitely what I think would be fundamental for European countries to have for their deterrence and defense posture is what it's called SEAD, which is suppression of enemy air defenses. So if European countries have a strong, wide, capable fleet of jet fighters capable to penetrate in depth the Russian territory and destroy key capabilities, including enemy air defenses, well, then for Russia, the idea of a confrontation becomes much, much harder because they would be exposed to our superior air power. So, and this connects to the question of Daniel, because obviously as we support Ukraine, Russia, and any adversary for the matter, has a strong incentive to try to undermine Europe in different areas where it's weaker. And we know that the critical infrastructures, especially undersea, are vulnerable. They're not the only ones. It's interesting because NATO has already launched a mission, it should be called Baltic Sentry, in order to defend those critical infrastructures. The problem is that if you put a lot of assets in the defense of critical infrastructures, well, then those very assets cannot be used for other tasks. So, for instance, for patrolling against anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic or in the Mediterranean and so forth. So, which still poses a fundamental question of resources allocation, how you allocate the best to face an intelligent or capable adversary.
Thank you, Andrea. That's always the trade-off problem and the opportunity cost problem that you mentioned before, and then should always be on the top of our minds. We have our friend Victoria Lapa, who is asking to intervene. So I don't know if I can do that, or if my colleagues can give her the floor. Okay, Victoria, we can see and hear you. Not see yet, but we see that.
Yeah. I think it's okay if I just speak. I don't know why the camera is not there. So thanks a lot. I think it was a very interesting discussion, but I have first one comment. If I understood correctly, like from Andrea's talk, it seems that the escalation is still like, I don't know, a big talk in the town, and Europe is still afraid of the escalation. At the same time, it seems that Andrea also said that, well, maybe Europe should have done more and should have given more help to Ukraine from the very beginning. So I have two questions. First, how we can push Russia to the negotiation table with reasonable concessions that it could make without kind of very harsh military support. Because a couple of days ago, Suslov, who is the counsel, I don't know, to the Kremlin, gave an interview to La Repubblica where he said that, well, we are not willing to make any concessions to Ukraine, and that Ukraine would disappear from the geographical map if they don't agree on what we want. And we want what we said from the very beginning. So how do we push Russia without military support if we are still afraid of escalation? Second question is, well, okay, if we manage, I don't know, in magic way, whatever way we manage to secure any peace deal, who will give security guarantees? Should Europe send its boots on the ground in Ukraine as a way to guarantee peace? This is kind of also the question for both experts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Victoria. Andrea, you want to start, and then we go to Olesya?
Yeah. So that's thanks for the and nice to at least hear you again. We don't see you. No, that's a good point. So I think so. The fact that I personally believe the nuclear threats from Russia are not extremely credible, so doesn't mean we should totally ignore. So that's these are two different levels. Ex post, I think we can say that Russia was playing gaslighting, so raising the nuclear threat only to scare Western countries, so to reduce the support to Ukraine, and this way secure its battlefield advantages. Now, ex post, we can say that was this way. Well, I remember, because I was working at NATO back then, it was less obvious. I mean, I think it would be intellectually honest to acknowledge that. So I think that's the second part of your discussion, how we secure a peace. Well, obviously, if Russia doesn't want to sit at the table, or better, doesn't want to give any concession, unfortunately, the only solution is providing Ukraine to all the weapon systems we can until Russia will be exhausted. The only challenge is that politically and economically, that may not be feasible for the long haul, meaning in 2025, 2027, but in 2030 or 2032 or whatever year you want, there may be another crisis around the world in other area, finance, technology, which may lead Europeans to at some point give up. So the idea of only thinking about we'll give more weapons until Russia is not exhausted doesn't think in doesn't consider the fact that this may be kind of a closed way from which we would be unable to get out. So that's my only worry, concern. I don't know if Olesya agrees or not.
Well, I have like a little bit a qualifying question on the question actually asked, because how can we push Russia to the peace deal without military support? So there are two ways of interpreting your question. So without military support, meaning withdrawing all military support or freezing it, I mean, no peace deal is going to happen. Okay, let's realize, I mean, the Ukrainian defenses will collapse. And so if we're talking about maintaining the support at the current level without expanding it or sustaining it, can we push Russia to the to the negotiation tables? The question for that is that have we explored or exploited all economic toolbox or toolbox for the economic sanctions to the fullest extent possible? Unfortunately, the answer is not quite so. Because tightening further Russia's ability to kind of to sell energy, to participate in the global economic market, it means imposing costs on ourselves. And then the question becomes how tolerant our constituents are, what are our pain thresholds, right? So that's why the trade-offs are we sustaining the military support? Are we trying to increase the military support to the point where the Ukrainian starting gaining, like we observe strategic gains or even like tactical gains on the ground that translate into visible, that force Russia to rethink its current position on what they want? So the answer, yes, but I don't think it's politically feasible to reach the consensus on the degree of use of sanctions that would be necessary to completely deprive Kremlin of the revenue sources, right? So that's one answer. The second part is like, can we have the security deal without the peace deal, without the security guarantees, and who would be the providing the security guarantees? It also, once again, goes back to the what would be the credible alternative, whether we can have boots on the ground, permanent stationing of the European forces with the no-fly zone potentially over the Ukrainian, still like territory to the Ukrainian control, but without the US implicit or explicit extended nuclear deterrence guarantee, it's going to be very difficult. So, well, I don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately.
No, probably nobody has. That's the problem with security guarantees, which are a key part of the equation, and we are not that yet. We have a second question by Roberto Castaldi, and which is very complex, but the message is clear. So he writes, the 27 countries, member states of Europe, have the third largest military expenditures in the world. They double that of Russia, 35% of US with a 10% capacity. This means that over 2/3 of the expenditures do not produce anything. How can EU defense expenditures become more effective? How should or can it be financed? Can the European Monetary Union model pool 27% of reserves be applied to military expenditures with the defense union, or can the EFSI Juncker plan golden rule provision be applied to national contributions to EU defense? I try to make it simpler. I mean, Italy spends 1.5% of its GDP for military expenditures, and apparently there is no political space to increase it. No party is advocating for it, and we are going to have German elections in 1 month, and Germany has a debt brake that basically collides with any serious defense ambition, as we saw with the unsuccessful Zeitenwende promised by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So how can we navigate this? I think, but I'm asking both of you to comment on that. I think that improving the efficiency of military spending is just, how to say, wishful thinking. It's not that simple. I mean, you cannot simply spend better in order to spend less. That was one conclusion of a policy brief published recently by Carlo Cottarelli. There is this efficiency myth, which is not that obvious how to make it concrete. Olesya, I don't know if we want to start.
Well, actually, this is kind of the biggest elephant in the room. Can we avoid spending more by making our current level of expenditures more effective, or converting them into capabilities? And actually, it just brings to mind a very interesting study, or seems to be consensus emerges, whether the innovation is a good solution to reducing the spending. And one of the key takeaways is that there seems to be negative correlations, that when innovation is done under the fiscal stress, it actually backfires. Okay, so we can argue about the methodology. So I think no, we should be spending more. It's clearly, the question is on which type of capabilities, and how do we explain to our constituents, or like why are we doing it? So the way how potentially we could be approaching it is more investing smarter rather than efficiency and smart investment and into defense. What do I mean by that? I think we should be thinking about not just the hardware, but of the ecosystem that we need in the long term to sustain the innovation, sustain having the labor force, and also training future forces to be able to use the future generation capabilities. So if we can link, or we can maximize positive spillovers from defense investment into other sectors, such as education, for example, or healthcare, or other tangible benefits, which our people actually can understand and translate into the personal, more tangible benefits for them, I think that would be a better way of going it, looking at it, or making it more feasible to sell to the voters. So,
thank you, Andrea. The same question for you, and I rephrase it slightly. So maybe we should think different ways and cheaper way of winning the war, rather than spending more efficiently the money we have to fight the war in the old style way. Because if we see what is, I mean, the two main differences in the Ukrainian war is that drones are a crucial variable, and drones are not as expensive as a jet fighter or traditional air defense equipments, and that satellites connection proved a new thing, and this is not something that was in our military budget. So Starship and Starlink and Elon Musk are a variable, and these are not things that are necessarily more expensive. They are just different.
Yeah. No. So, I mean, I answer your question starting from the broader one. I mean, one is about ultimately sovereignty, meaning obviously if every single European country takes down all the military bases and barracks, which as of now would not make much sense. I mean, think about all the bases spread around Europe of all the countries, all the military colleges that there are in Europe, just to give an example. Obviously, you could generate significant savings, yes, but there would have to be a European single military force, and that's about sovereignty. And that requires a big step. So that's one aspect. Insofar, there are different armies, different armed forces. Some, in a way, duplication is necessary. Are there solutions to do things better? Yes, absolutely. Europeans have achieved some success, but not so much. And here I arrive to the innovation aspect. One problem in Europe has been that we have mostly for the past 20 years thought as the foreign policy of the European Union, or the defense policy of the European Union, actually serving the defense industry rather than serving our security goals. So that's one aspect which, in a way, led to kind of a paralysis. What I'm thinking about. European countries have launched projects with the main goal of supporting the defense industrial base rather than generating defense capabilities which were needed. So if you look at the capability gaps which are around Europe, part of the explanation lies there. And this would be one way. But at the same time, obviously, we have reduced so much defense spending some 20, 25 years ago, which many of our defense companies risked to shake. I don't have the perfect answer, but definitely Europe needs more innovation, not only in defense, more in general. They would probably need to have a brutal approach, more similar to DARPA than to what has been pursued so far. There's another great report that IEP Bocconi has produced 1 year ago about research funding in Europe, research expenditure, which shows that European the research is unable to generate breakthrough technological developments. And this applies a bit also to defense, where definitely some innovations could be a way to achieve the same amount of effectiveness while also keeping budgets down. But innovation is not a silver bullet, it's not always is as cheap as we initially planned. That's also important to bear in mind.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on DARPA, if I allow very briefly. I think the issues here is that it's not just setting up the bureaucratic organization, which DARPA was not really set up as a bureaucratic organization. It followed the best practices of the private sector. So it allowed people from the industry was allowed to run the show. I mean, that was one of the innovation at the bureaucratic level in the United States. And also it had the requirement that there are no renewed contracts. So you get the grant only once and that's it. So you can apply for a different grant. So that's kind of one of the very peculiar feature of DARPA that I think was very successful. But I think the issue is of the overall capital, like private capital to finance investment, because even not even talking about defense sector, generally, if you compare what's the amount of private capital that goes into the research and development and innovation in the United States, it's by far surpasses the private capital in Europe. So this is a general issue of financing innovation. It's not just defense innovation. And going back, we're talking about technologies which tend to be dual capable, right? Dual use technology. So sometimes you develop technology and it's far too early to say whether it's going to have a game-changing implication for the defense sector. So that's why I talk about this like ecosystem that capable of support innovation generally, and then linking it and scaling up it for defense system. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you. We have time for a very last question by Sebastiano Dell'Acqua, which brings us back to traditional war on the field with soldiers and brigades and the people who actually fight for their lives. Basically, Sebastiano asked if we are why we are not worried that basically NATO is not fully operational on the field as the Ukrainian soldiers. So basically, he says that the fact that basically we rely on Ukrainian brigades probably undermines NATO's perceived capability and thus its deterrent effect. If I can rephrase, should we rely on Ukraine as the real European and NATO combat force as NATO and European countries focus more on research and long-term projects, while these people are the one who are actually fighting for us? This is a message that the Zelensky administration has repeated many times, that basically they are developing a unique combat capability that is not only in the interest of Ukraine, but in the interest of all the NATO and European countries. I don't know if you want to start, Olesya, with that. Also, if you can explain us how the North Korean troops enter in this equation, because Russia apparently had a problem in deploying people and so they relied on these probably unqualified soldiers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing us back to the importance of the manpower regeneration, because to be able to do that, you have to maintain combat-capable reserve forces. And the United States has like a really great model for that when you have the contractors who are part of your combat-capable reserve force. Europe does not quite have it, with certain exception of Finland and Sweden. Some Baltic states are adopting this because we don't have universal conscription, right? We kind of forgot about it as a politically very costly thing to maintain your forces. And now it's literally that an awakening moment. Recently, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, there was actually a special meeting at NATO dedicated to assessing how well our reserve component is doing and whether it's capable of being like combat ready. And well, of course, the assessment is yes, we are ready. But the key lessons learned from the Russians, they were neglecting, under investing in it. And that's why in the short run, they're not capable of scaling up, even if they can arm their large scale million additional forces. But that's why they're relying on the Koreans. So what the Ukrainians are proposing, they have the know-how now, and they have combat trained troops, but it's not the entire population of male population. I mean, they deliberately postponing drafting people who are between 18 and 25 because they're not trained. So they're themselves having this shortage of the trained manpower, not just manpower. But there are certain lessons that we need to be taking into the account when we talk about our combat readiness. I give it to Andrea.
Okay, Andrea.
Yeah,
How
so I
much
guess
should we rely on Ukrainian army in the long run?
The question was also about the credibility. So I hope personally that the war will come to an end and Ukraine will not have to go for much, much longer, because obviously it is causing a lot of distraction, a lot of personal losses. Olesya was pointing to the conscription and to the young generation was kind of exempted. There's also a more broader political aspect that if you, as a country, you lose those so young, well, the country won't have a future. There won't be families, there won't be children, there will be no Ukraine in some years or decades. So we may reason in different. There are obviously many considerations, but that's also plays a role. And this goes to the credibility. I think I see the question. I think that I don't fully agree, meaning that NATO countries have been helping Ukrainian forces train and obviously equipped even before the war, not much, but a bit, but especially after the war. And Ukrainian forces have been fighting bravely and successfully, especially because they are facing a bigger and more firepower-heavy adversary. However, we have to just bear in mind that the capabilities that they have are more limited. So any European country, any NATO country would probably fight in a very different way. So I would not compare the military effectiveness or combat effectiveness of Ukrainian brigades with ours, because we would use probably much more air power. We would use much more electronic warfare at the very beginning, long-range precision strike. This, which in turn brings the question to the very beginning, should we not try to provide as much firepower possible to the Ukrainians so to reduce the attrition on the very front line? But the production capacity is limited for us as well, not only for Russia. It's also very expensive. I mean, if you look at in the paper, and Stefano, you may remember that we look at the data and more or less the amount of procurement expenditure which increased in the past year, it's analogous to the amount of equipment that European countries have been providing to Ukraine itself. So at the end, we're talking about 40, 50 billions a billion more, billion less. I mean, it's not just peanuts. It's a significant amount of money. And there's so much we can probably do. These are big questions. So from my side, I don't know how much more time we have. I just thank you for the invitation, the time, and all the participants. I guess the two of you want to say a few more words.
Yeah, we are basically running out of time. So I thank you, both of you, Olesya and Andrea, for this very insightful conversation. As I think we all agree that it's an open conversation. We are not close to an end of this debate, unfortunately, but we will keep on working on it, thanks to Andrea at the Institute. And let me remind you to read the paper. I forgot to mention that there are two co-authors with Andrea. They are Mauro Gilli and Nicolò Petrelli. And we will have other conversation on defense and security. So stay tuned and subscribe the IEP newsletter in order not to miss any of the following events. And let me just conclude with remembering that we have a seminar, a webinar next in 10 days, which is focused on digital regulation, which is part of the story, how Europe can leverage its digital regulation to catch up with the US and to pursue its strategic autonomy and all the goals that we have in terms of innovation and how to say, survival in a challenging international and even transatlantic context. So thank you all for this conversation, and see you soon.